or you or anyone? Just your screen.
That's because it's sharing a screen.
Yeah.
You should have two windows. One should be the one that shares Zoom. When you click on the Zoom thing, you should have two windows on there.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Bear in mind, we're live, so if someone comes in, they will hear you.
Okay.
Hi everyone, welcome. For those who are on the line, we'll just give a few more minutes for people to come in and then we'll make a start. Welcome to those who have just joined. We are just waiting a few more minutes before we start. We have a number of people who are logging in as we speak. Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to those who have just joined. We're just waiting just a couple more minutes. There are people still coming in, and then we will make a start. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar for today, themed around knowledge exchange and commercialization adventures from around the world. We will be starting in just a few minutes, and I will be handing over to my colleague, Richard Johnson, who will be facilitating and leading you through these adventures around the world. I hope you enjoy this, and yeah, over to you, Richard.
Hey, thank you, Fabio, and thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. So just to give you an overview of what the format of the webinar is, I'll speak with Michael, and we'll have in a kind of an interview style format for the first half of the webinar, for the first half of the session. And then towards the end of the webinar, we'll open it up to the audience for some questions. So you can either feel free to wait and hold your questions to the end, or feel free to type your questions as they come into your head as you're going through the webinar. So just type them in the chat box, and I'll pick them up, or Fabio will pick them up, and we can cover them at the end. So to introduce myself, I'm Richard Johnson. I've joined Oxentia in about 2017. I kind of support clients with technology commercialization and technical due diligence, carrying out stakeholder needs analysis and innovation strategy. I worked with corporations, universities and foundations across the world to support open innovation and development of new technologies based on collaborative partnerships. So before I joined Oxentia in March 2017, I worked for oil and gas majors, independent and national companies in 11 countries around the world, working on new technology development, marketing and operations with internal development teams, and also assessing external technology opportunities. So I've got a PhD in environmental microbiology, and outside my time at Oxentia, I spend mostly running around after my two sons, aged 19 months and 6 years old. And I'm here today with my colleague Michael Mbogoro. I think the M is silent. I think it is, yeah. It is. So Michael joined Oxentia in 2014, and he helps clients to design entrepreneurship centres, or has helped clients to design entrepreneurship centres in Europe, develop innovation policies and strategies in Latin America, and identify high-value technologies for Asian conglomerates. He's worked on technology commercialization projects with clients in academia, in government, and in the private sector, in the electronics and engineering sectors. So Michael enjoys mentoring innovation professionals and innovators and policymakers as they try to navigate the various challenges in the technology commercialization process. he leverages the expertise that he's gained from working in more than 18 different countries. So you're 7 up on me there, Michael, in this. So Michael's got a PhD in physical chemistry, and outside of Oxentia, he enjoys Latin dance and theatre, as well as trying culinary delights from all corners of the world. So I think that last thing goes very well into your traveling and the support you've been giving all around the world. So I was going to start off by asking, what's the favorite thing, or what's your favorite thing you've eaten, or the favorite place you've eaten
my God.
on all your travels? So
I have to admit, that is probably the most impossible question. I think the part of the point of traveling is to make sure you sort of immerse yourself into local cultures and try the music, the food, the sights, the people, just to get a taste of something that's not what you're used to. And I suppose that's an extension of the work itself, where, you're going into environments that are quite culturally unique compared to where you come from. And being able to try as far as possible to understand why they're different and why they have the pressures that they do, makes it a lot easier to sort of partner and work with them to implement some of the solutions you come up with, whether it's new innovation policy, whether it's route to market for new technologies, whether it's creating that knowledge exchange and commercialization infrastructure that universities need or governments need, or development agencies or foundations might work with.
Yeah. So how do you think that the local and the regional practices affect the innovation ecosystem's routes to market? Have you got any kind of good examples of where a particular practice or regional practice or regional thinking or affects how things work? Yeah.
So I'd say that in any functioning ecosystem, you have the key stakeholders. You have the government, you have business, you have capital providers, you have the research area, and also you have the local community. And also in the community, you have entrepreneurs, whether high tech or otherwise. And all of these stakeholders will have a different level of influence on what the ecosystem looks like, and even the route to market for technologies or innovations within that market. So in my travels, I've seen sort of regional similarities. So for instance, in Latin America, government is really quite influential in the health of the innovation ecosystem. So this is through a lot of the funding programs that they may have for different initiatives. And when you look closely, a fair amount of these initiatives have their source funding from a development agency like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank. And so what I find in Latin America is without this, really strong support from government, it becomes a little bit hard to get anything off the ground. Partly because lots of countries have a growing research output. So it's not at the volume that you might find in Far East or in Europe, but it is growing. You do have exceptions, the likes of Mexico, Chile, Brazil, and Argentina, where there's quite a lot of high volume, high quality research from the universities. But that government aspect is what is really pushing things across. Businesses, to a large extent, tend to rely on innovations coming in from abroad. So the involvement in the ecosystem, again, may not be as strong as you might see in other places. And then when you shift that across to, say, the Middle East, particularly Gulf states, then the dynamic changes a fair amount. Again, in this case, almost all the cash, I would probably imagine, a lot of the cash comes from the local governments themselves, partly because, this is a lot of oil-rich oil money that they're using to spend on infrastructure and innovation programs. So the issue there is never about money. There's always a pot of cash that can be spent on something. Where we don't have as much, where it's a little bit weak or needs a bit of development is in the volume of research that's coming out of universities. They're not that many, that's for starters. So you have this pot of cash. The volume of research is not very high. So where is that money spent? And it's often spent on the common citizen who has a business idea. May or may not be high-tech innovation with lots of IP. It may be, I want to open a bakery, right? And so you have that connection between the local citizen and the government. And when you travel in some countries, you'll see franchises of lots of the American brands you would know, like Baskin Robbins, Dunkin' Donuts, Starbucks. So the issue here is really that volume of research that should come out of university or research-intensive institutions. That's what may be lacking a little bit. And then when you go to some other parts, like South Africa, for instance, there's been a shift over the last 20 years or so where the government is trying to facilitate as much of the business arm as possible to partake in the ecosystem. So there they have some rather generous tax incentives. I mean, really, in some cases more generous than you might find in Europe, where the tax rebates are really particularly high, and that is to incentivize companies to put money into R&D, and then more than that, to participate in the local ecosystem. So working with universities, trying to support getting innovations out into the market, right? So the reasons tend to shift across depending on where you are on the planet. Latin America, heavily government, but international development agencies putting a lot of the money in, but there's a volume of research that may be comparable to what you might find in Europe. In the Middle East, not as much research, but a lot of money from government, and that connection is to a local citizen, which might then manifest through incubators and accelerators and the like. In Southeast Asia, it's sort of a strange mix between what you see in the Middle East and Latin America, where not that much money coming from government, partly because it's not all reach, lots of other priorities. But business is a little bit more keen to participate. So when I say Southeast Asia, there's a difference between, say, the likes of Thailand, Malaysia, compared to, say, the likes of Singapore, South Korea, and Japan, which are far more, have much more mature innovation ecosystems.
And is there any kind of key part of an innovation ecosystem that you kind of either, well, I suppose, find everywhere and also needs to be present everywhere for the ecosystem to kind of benefit and to be really working well?
So I suppose this might have to go back to the fundamentals of what that innovation ecosystem looks like. So you have the main stakeholders, like you would anywhere on the planet. So you have the government, right? And the government here is really taking on that role of a farmer. And the role of the farmer is to prepare the land, to make sure that it's fertile, to ensure that there are no weeds that are cropping up to ruin the crop that will be growing in that space. You then have the research. Sorry?
So here, do you mean in the UK?
No. I mean when I say an innovation ecosystem, what one should look like. So it's not UK centric at all. Okay. This is global. So you have the government as a farmer. You have the research or entrepreneurial community, and this is where you're getting the seed, that new idea, that innovation, that invention that is going to be planted on that land that has been created or prepared by the farmer government, right? And then beyond that, you have the capital providers. So within this analogy would be the fertilizer or those that water the system to help this seed grow. And I suppose there's a distinction here because the farmer should provide a little bit of that fertilizer, particularly at that early stage where the seed is unlikely to survive without that sort of support. And once it gets to a certain point, that capital provision from angels or proof of concept funds or venture capital down the line and private equity even further down is what really helps that acceleration and growth to come out. And then you have the business sector, which might provide some of that fertilizer. You have corporate venture capital, you have research collaborations, you have contract research to engage that research community and also help this seed grow into something that is useful for the market. But ultimately, the community is what really, which may not fit well into this analogy, but community is what helps get everything working. It's the glue that connects that government program to that research-intensive organization, or to that entrepreneur, or to the capital provider, or to the business sector, this glue that connects them all, because it's really all about relationships. And increasingly, particularly in, I've seen a lot of this in some parts of Latin America. It's quite heavily done in Europe as well, is the inclusion of this, what they call the fourth sector, the charity sector, non-governmental agencies, foundations. So examples being the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as an example, where they're putting this $1 billion budget towards certain UN sustainable goals. So in their case, it's sanitation as an example. And they actively seek out innovators from wherever they are on the planet who have these ideas that may address those SDGs. And they will work with them in a very similar way as a technology transfer office might, or a seed funder would, to try and push these ideas to the market, or to a point where they can be of benefit to those who need it. And I'd say so, the core stakeholder being government, the research and entrepreneurial community, the capital providers, and there's business, and then there's that community glue that connects them. But increasingly you have this sort of charity sector coming in. And the ecosystems that have all of these, part one, the fact that they exist, you have all of these stakeholders existing. And then two, that they are breaking down the silos and talking to each other. And then three, it's the strength of these connections and the glue that connect them, that make it really come alive and work. Because as I would say, as we know, people help their friends. Your friend you're more likely to help your friend than not. So that relationship and the glue is really what makes this stakeholder relationship really impactful from our experience.
Okay. I try not to talk too much about the C word in terms of coronavirus. I'm sure lots of people being here a lot about it at the minute, but it sounds very clear that the glue, the communications, the networks talking to each other is a key part of innovation ecosystems.
I could give an example actually of this. A good example of this is Medellin in Colombia, an organization called Ruta N. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you maybe not. And this was an organization that was built in the Northeast, where the local government came together with a utility company and a community-led organizations. And together, the utility companies and local government put money into the pot to create this innovation district, right? And what they did was, at the time, Medellin was sort of up and coming, recovering from the ravages of the drug trade in the 90s and in the 80s and 90s. And they were looking to sort of do something special to sort of leave this sort of heritage behind and get into the 21st century. And what they did was identify experts from around the world, from technical experts, innovation managers, the top universities, the best business speakers, and they would bring them in at whatever that cost was to help them create this environment. And now Medellin is one of the most innovative parts of Colombia. And what happens is, when you have something like that is sort of homegrown locally, where you truly see how these connections interact and how they build on each other and how they identify local problems and solutions that are a mix of locally derived solutions and those from the outside, whether it's best practice, whether it's the inclusion of a technology-enabled solution, whatever it is. It then becomes a bit of a role model for what other parts of the country can do. And now the Medellin or Ruta N community is now consults to lots of other organizations in the region and internationally as to how to come from a very low foundation, where many people within that community are not very much above the poverty line, to a place where it's one of the most innovative parts of the communities in Latin America.
So do you think the impacts of communication in terms of meeting people with coronavirus has impacted very much, and how do you expect COVID-19 to impact KEC generally around the world on this?
I think
I'm kind of asking you to look into a glass ball here.
Yes. I mean, the thing is, it's become a question that we have asked our clients, our partners, our collaborators. This is a key question because I think everyone has to change how they do what they do to live in this in this COVID world, and then beyond that into the post-COVID world. And so I suppose a fundamental part of being human is to interact with each other, to literally see someone face to face and talk to them, build rapport and a relationship. And so having that screen between you and them does disrupt things to some extent, and you may not be able to form the same sort of connections, perhaps. Sorry, I think there's there's someone drilling somewhere near me. I apologize for that. But the general effect of COVID on KEC is that we have had reports, or in our discussions with our friends in government, friends in foundations, friends in universities, they have told us that everything is going to be is very significantly negatively impacted, right? We know that it will slow down both the generation of new ideas, the support ecosystem that helps these ideas go to the market, and later, whether these ideas can be absorbed into the market, right? It affects all of these things. So if we take an example of government, for instance, much of their pots of money, much of those are going to be diverted towards the emergency response, whether that is catering to the healthcare needs of the country or supporting those who, for no fault of their own, become unemployed because companies are closing down. So you have a lot more people in the community who need some sort of social benefit, right? And then beyond that, because these many companies are closing, you get the revenue that comes through from tax is lower. So the size of the government pot of cash is going to be much, much smaller this year than it was in the previous years, or than it was under normal circumstances. And so because of this, it puts a limit on what resources a government can put into the innovation ecosystem, perhaps, partly because there are some more urgent needs, right?
Yeah.
Then when you look at universities, students can't go to university. So universities are having to shift to remote delivery of some of their courses. And of course, for students who have to pay fees, they say, if I'm going to be looking at a screen, why should I pay you however much you're asking for if I don't get to interact with you in the normal way? And this is maybe doubly so for the sciences, where you typically need to be in a laboratory interacting with chemicals or other materials of that sort. So there's a huge limit to how much universities can do, and they're having to adapt to this. And because, again, income from students will be lower for the next academic year, that means the university's facilities and capabilities might have to shrink, which includes their staff. And that may also include how they support the innovations that are being generated from the university to go to market. And beyond that, the university's contribution to the ecosystem. So that's governments and universities. When you look at the business world, this one is maybe a little bit more straightforward. People for many industries, people are not buying because they can't. So retail sector, hospitality, tourism, aviation, these are good examples of contracting markets at the moment. You do have some that are growing. So tech-enabled technologies sometimes are in some cases growing quite well. Examples being the likes of Zoom, Teams, Amazon, anything that has robotics and doesn't require the physical intervention of a human. Those may be growing. So it's a bit of a mixed bag in the business world. But also there's a huge effect in the capital provider community, where if it's a high net worth individual with a few $100,000 to spend on innovations, because of how things are at the moment, they might withdraw that cash from a hedge fund that they had invested in, or they might be a bit more careful about whether they invest at all if they do. And then if you go to the more serious pots of cash, the venture capitalists, they have the similar issues where they are increasingly not convinced that the opportunities that come to them as potential for investment, that they will grow at the rate they expect, and therefore they are unlikely to get the returns they were hoping for. So they are also a bit more risk averse than usual. And that is in some ways a bit odd. I was speaking to one a few days ago, and she was telling me that while you have all the pot of money does exist, but they're not going to spend it. And in fact, some of their shareholders are taking their money out to put in a bank or under their pillow, which is safer. The opportunities that they might invest in, so these are the startups or the spin-outs from universities, they could not be cheaper than they are right now, right? Because the runway that they tend to have for, between where they are and the market has contracted a little bit. So their prospects of meeting the projections they had in their cash flow statements are less likely. And so as an opportunity, it will be valued lower than it might have been under normal circumstances. So that means that the opportunity is cheaper. But this big capital provider is worried that even if they do buy it, it might not actually make much money over the next year or so because of the contracting market. So this is how it's affecting all of these. What, however, continues to be reasonably strong is that community. People are talking to each other. The relationships are maintained. And some of the local business mentors that we interact with, as an example here in Oxford, are very clear that they see that while a lot of people will be losing their jobs or shifting into new positions, it does mean that there will be perhaps the creation of lots of new businesses, because you realize for the first time that you're not so keen on the company you are working in as an employee. You have an opportunity to pursue that business idea because it may be technology enabled and you can do it from home. And therefore you think, I will branch out on my own and create my own thing. So there'll be a community of new entrepreneurs being created who may have to rely on an ecosystem that has been significantly weakened by the ongoing crisis.
You mentioned about capital and venture capital. So within Europe, for example, or within the US, there's a fairly good amount of venture capital around. What should kind of local entrepreneurs do in ecosystems around the world, particularly in developing ecosystems where there's little venture capital present? What kind of support mechanisms are available or should be available to them?
Yeah. There's always, I think in all the places that we've been traveling to, there's always a pot of cash that exists, right? So while it may not be venture capital, there'll be a cluster of very high net worth individuals who are wondering what to do with all the money that they have made. However, what can the innovation ecosystem do? There's a huge role to be played by government in this case, and that is to do two things: make it easier and less risky for capital providers to participate in the ecosystem. So that would be, for instance, extending the runway for entrepreneurs by providing translational funding. So this is a small pot of money that can be used by an innovator, whether that's a researcher or an entrepreneur, to take that idea. You have an idea that you may have developed a prototype for. It's to extend that runway to demonstrate that prototype or idea at a level that is acceptable for the market. So you're extending the runway. This is similar to that government farmer adding a little bit of water and fertilizer or manure at the really early stage when the seed is just about to germinate. That's when it's really important. Once it's a bit more self-sustaining, it reduces that risk for those capital providers, and they might want to then participate. The other thing that we've seen around the world, a few programs in Europe and a few that have come up in Latin America and Southeast Asia in particular, is to provide incentives that make it easier for both businesses and high net worth individuals to put money into the pot. So this would be the tax incentive is an easy one for businesses to participate in. But for high net worth individuals, it's to create a mechanism that can protect their investment. So an example of this would be if Richard is a millionaire who is sitting on a lot of money and not spending it in the innovation space, and I'd like him to. So what I might, as a government program, is to create a mechanism in which I will match fund what Richard will put into the pot. So he puts $500,000, I put $500,000, and we have £1 million in the pot, or $1 million in the pot. And this $1 million is then spent on early stage innovations. And we have an agreement where for any upside, where our investments have made a good return and we are about to exit and make our returns as investors, the first 50% of upside is taken by Richard as the individual high net worth investor. And then anything beyond that, as a government official, as a government program, we then can take some of the rest. And also you're giving him an incentive on the upside, but also you can protect the downside, where you might say that if our investment makes a loss, the first 50% of the losses, I as a government will absorb those as the loss to protect that high net worth individual's investment. But anything beyond that, we then start to share. So the idea here is to decrease the risk in all directions until such a time that these investors who might traditionally put their money into real estate, as an example, or commodities, might start to be more comfortable with this innovation. So this high risk innovation space. Because a lot of the time it's about exposure and experience. And once you have it, that government incentive can be removed, and they might be able to know enough about it that they can take it on board from that point, right? But again, then at the end of all this, it's all about building that relationship and making friends. Creating that glue is tremendously vital, as we have seen in the UK, in clusters like Oxford, Cambridge, London, where those communities have an incredibly high turnout or output when it comes to innovations reaching the market or getting to the point where they're helping the common citizen in some way.
Do you think, so you mentioned earlier about in some regions, for example, in the Middle East, there's a lot of focus on individuals and individual development and technology development, whereas in other regions, there might be quite a lot of output coming from universities. So different innovation ecosystems maybe focus on different either individuals compared to institutions or universities. Do you think that either works better, or is it really just tailored to the region's needs?
So I suppose the question is, should we focus on individuals or institutions, right?
Yes, yeah.
To be honest, it's impossible not to do both. So you need that land to be fertile and weed-free. So you need a really good institutions that have good governance, that have appropriate policies that make it easy for the rest of all the other stakeholders to participate. You need accountability. You need good monitoring and evaluation mechanisms so that you can learn from what you're doing and the next iteration looks really good, right? And works even better. But at the heart of all this is that individual with a good idea or a collection of individuals who are developing these new ideas, and they might want to do really good things for their community. So to improve the livelihood, the well-being of the common citizen. Some might want to simply make some money and move up the socioeconomic ladder. So to do this properly, you absolutely need the environment to be fertile and easy, so that those ideas are easy to generate and develop, right? You do need both, but institutions have to have essentially prepared the land for this to happen.
Yeah. Okay. So we're kind of coming towards the end of our kind of chat together. I have got one question actually. We've got one question come through on the chat box. It's kind of linked actually to a question that I was going to ask anyway. So my initial question was to understand what international development bodies should do to improve innovation in the middle income countries that they work in. And the question actually from the participants here is particularly focusing on the United Nations and what role they should play in primarily facilitating technology transfer. So I suppose what kind of role do you see in international development bodies, including the United Nations, playing in knowledge exchange and commercialization?
So there are quite a few that sort of fit into this category. So you have the likes of the UN, you have the Inter-America Development Bank, you have the World Bank, you have the EU that funds quite a lot of this, and then you have different development agencies that are sort of that have contributions from different countries for individual countries, right? And historically, they've had, I suppose, a mixed results when it comes to supporting innovation ecosystems. Partly because it's been traditionally a little bit, how do I say, patronizing, but I use that loosely, where we know how things work and they work well where we are, so we'll give you money if you do things like we do them. Right? So that was sort of standard policy for a while, and then it doesn't really bear the dividends that you want. So for them to work well, so examples that I've seen or directly been involved in would be, say, the World Bank giving a loan or a grant to a country like Peru, and that grant will then be spent by the Ministry of Production or the National Council of Science and Technology to then implement an innovation program of some sort, right? So there's a little bit of a few middlemen along the way between the money and the beneficiary, right? There needs to be a very strong and fundamental understanding of the socio-cultural practices in the beneficiary community. So what works in Europe is unlikely to work in Latin America, Southeast Asia, Middle East, Africa, because the cultural practices are really quite different. And then beyond that, the pressures are also quite unique and quite different. We have to remember that middle-income countries, while they're not thinking of places like that are, at the bottom end, like Somalia as an example, which is coming out of quite a protracted civil war, and innovation ecosystem is not really in the same way as we would think about it in Europe. So middle income are, essentially much higher than that in terms of the livelihood of the common citizen. But even then, they do have a proportion of their community that is living under the poverty line. They need to think about really providing some primary needs for their citizens. So this includes, does everyone in our community have good health care? Can they all have access to education? Can they all have shelter? Do they all have food? So while you're thinking of you have a reasonably advanced economy, but on the other hand, you have a proportion of your community that is really suffering. If you do have that pot of money, or you get access to that pot of money from a development agency, if you're coming from this local middle-income country, you might find that you have very different pressures. So some people might say that, while that pot of money is great, I think it's more important to focus it on dealing with that Zika virus epidemic that we have than to create an incubator, right? We need to deal with this small group, this favela or this township that we have, rather than spending it on giving big companies incentives to not pay their taxes. So the pressures are really quite different. So so development agencies need to have an understanding of these local pressures to truly be able to be impactful in how they spend not only their money, but also their resources. And from that middle-income government perspective, particularly when we've spoken to policymakers in places like Malaysia or Thailand or Peru, Mexico, Argentina, they say that, you know, you have politicians they want really quick results. They want to stand on a podium and say, look at all the wonderful things we've done in the 2 months we have been in power, right? But these policymakers understand that we know what our community needs because we've asked them, we've worked with them and consulted, so we have a really good understanding of local needs, right? But the program we can put in place with that money from the development agency will take 3-4 years to really demonstrate impact. And by that time, this politician will be out of office and someone else will be in, and they want something different. So there's a mismatch between the period of time that it takes to demonstrate impact and these pressures that come in through political cycles. And then beyond that, you have that development agency that's looking in at this, what might seem quite chaotic, and might then impose a certain idea of what is right or what is appropriate, which may not have anything to do with what is needed on the ground. So that fundamental understanding of the local sociocultural pressures and practices is really quite crucial for us. And then from the innovation policy person or the local university, I have a certain amount of maybe a small pot of money that I have to compete for. I live in an environment where we don't have this, or there are gaps there, or our strengths are not like they are in Germany. So I have to do what I can with what I have right here in my local landscape. And that's quite different from what that development agency might think is appropriate or needed. Yeah.
Thank you, Vipin, for that question. So we've got another question from Leo. I'm not quite sure. So Leo was asking, will the traditional steps of KEC, so invention, IP protection, looking for partners, licensing, commercialization, are they still applicable? So I'm not sure if this is
within the context of COVID,
within the context of Globid, or within the context of different regions and different areas. So we'll kind of maybe talk about the different regions and areas first, and then we can add a little bit on that if there are any changes to KEC.
Okay, I would say the general process of commercialization tends to be quite universal. You find ideas, you sift through them to identify the really good ones. For those, when I say good, there's a market for it, you might be able to protect it. You have a really strong team, all those you have validated it, all those really, business support things that you need to have in place. And then you maybe protect it, go into the development, you might license it or create a company, and then have some sort of post-deal maintenance or auditing. So that process is quite universal. Happens the same way everywhere on the planet. What is different is the risk appetite of the capital providers in a particular region. It's, can I really, if I protect this IP, this invention with a patent, can I really defend it when someone infringes on that? That is quite regionally specific. So I'd say in places like Scandinavia, the regime is such that you can truly chase someone in court and perhaps win. But when we've spoken to Kuwaitis, I've had people say, someone can open a factory across the road from me, making exactly the same thing. And even if I do chase them, sometimes that local court might be indifferent, or they might have priorities elsewhere, or there's a huge delay because there are many other cases. So the universal process is the same, but you have these regional changes based on how the local culture interacts. How will this be different after the pandemic? It is likely that the filtering mechanism of what makes a good idea might change. It might be that you have all these industries that have been affected greatly by the pandemic, all the ones that I mentioned in hospitality, retail, and the like. So it might be that those that survive that initial assessment might be the ones in those markets that are likely to grow quite well. So tech-enabled technologies, robotics, digital type technologies and inventions, those might do rather well in the period immediately post-COVID, when we're sort of still getting back on our feet. It's also likely that the risk aversion will become a bit more universal. So it's not just the Latinos the Latino venture capitalists or investors who want to put their money in real estate. It might be that universally there might be a lot more risk averse because they're not sure there's truly a market in these opportunities. What that means is that this valley of death period, where I said the gardener has to put a little bit of fertilizer and water at the beginning, that may be impacted quite a bit, I would suspect, partly because of this diversion of government funds or resources elsewhere. So I think it'll all slow, or the whole thing will slow down a bit. And it'll be more pronounced when it comes to risk aversion and ideas that are considered high potential for commercialization.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know if there's any more questions from the audience. If anybody does have any more questions, feel free to get in touch with us at Oxentia. Our website's oxentia.com or info@oxentia, or directly with myself or Michael. And with that, I'd like to thank Michael and so thank you everyone for attending, and say goodbye.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Fabio. Bye-bye.